12 ordinary men received an assignment that would cost them everything. They were promised persecution, suffering, and death. Yet every single one accepted the mission without hesitation. What transformed these fishermen, tax collectors, and common laborers into fearless warriors who would face execution rather than deny their message? The answer lies hidden in ancient texts, archaeological discoveries, and historical records that reveal a story far more compelling than most have ever heard. Before we journey into the final days of Christ's chosen 12, we must understand something crucial. These men were not religious fanatics seeking martyrdom. They were not delusional followers of a failed revolutionary. Historical evidence suggests they were rational individuals who witnessed something so undeniable, so transformative that it rewired their entire understanding of reality. Scholars have debated for centuries what could possibly convince 12 separate individuals to accept torture and execution rather than simply recant a story. The answer to that question forms the foundation of the largest faith movement in human history. The story begins in Jerusalem, approximately 33 years after the birth of Christ. The city buzzed with tension as Passover celebrations filled the streets with pilgrims from across the Roman Empire. Among the crowds walked 12 men who had spent 3 years following a controversial teacher from Nazareth. They had witnessed healings that defied medical explanation. They had seen storms instantly calmed by spoken commands. They had watched as their master fed thousands from a handful of food, but nothing prepared them for what would happen next. When Roman soldiers arrested Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, the 12 scattered like frightened sheep. Peter, the boldest among them, followed at a distance only to deny knowing Jesus 3 times before sunrise. Thomas disappeared into hiding. James and John, the sons of thunder who once promised to die alongside their master, fled into the darkness. These were not brave men in that moment. They were terrified individuals who had just watched their 3-year investment in a messianic movement collapse in a single night. The crucifixion should have ended everything. Roman executions were designed not just to kill but to humiliate and terrorize. When Jesus died on that cross, his followers faced a devastating reality. Their teacher was dead. Their hopes were crushed. Their futures were uncertain. Logic dictated they should return to their fishing boats, their tax collection tables, and their former lives. Admitting they had been wrong would be embarrassing but safe. Continuing to promote a dead Messiah would be dangerous and foolish. Yet something happened that changed everything. Historical records indicate that within days of the crucifixion, these same terrified men emerged from hiding with an unshakable conviction. They proclaimed that Jesus had risen from the dead. They claimed to have seen him, touched him, and eaten with him. They transformed from cowards into bold proclaimers who could not be silenced by threats, imprisonment, or violence. The Book of Acts documents their fearless preaching in the very city where Jesus had been executed, standing before the same authorities who had ordered his death. But here is where the story becomes truly fascinating. If the resurrection was a fabrication, if these men were perpetrating a fraud, their behavior makes absolutely no sense. Con artists do not maintain elaborate lies when facing torture and execution. They break under pressure. They seek deals. They save their own lives. Yet historical records show that 11 of the 12 apostles went to their deaths, refusing to recant their testimony. The 12th, Judas Iscariot, took his own life immediately after betraying Jesus, consumed by guilt that suggests he knew he had betrayed an innocent man. Ancient historians, including those hostile to Christianity, documented the persecution of early Christians under various Roman emperors. Tacitus, a Roman senator and historian who had no love for Christians, wrote about their persecution under Nero around 64 AD. He described how Christians were burned alive, torn apart by dogs, and crucified for public entertainment. Pliny the Younger, a Roman governor, wrote letters asking Emperor Trajan how to deal with Christians who refused to renounce their faith even under torture. These are not Christian sources. These are hostile witnesses who inadvertently confirm that early believers died rather than deny their testimony. Archaeological discoveries continue to support the historical existence of these 12 men and their missions. Excavations in Rome have uncovered evidence of early Christian meeting places beneath the Vatican, suggesting Peter's presence in the Eternal City. Discoveries in India have revealed ancient Christian communities that trace their origins to the Apostle Thomas. Inscriptions found in Turkey reference early Christian communities established by John and Philip. While archaeology cannot prove every detail of their stories, it consistently confirms the broad historical framework of their travels and missions. The story of the 12 apostles is not merely ancient history. It represents a mystery that historians, theologians, and skeptics continue to debate. What evidence convinced these men so thoroughly that they willingly accepted execution rather than admit error? Were they deluded? Were they lying? Or did they genuinely experience something that provided absolute certainty worth dying for? As we explore each apostle's final journey, we will examine the historical evidence, the ancient traditions, and the lingering questions that make their stories as relevant today as 2,000 years ago. Subscribe to this channel if you want to discover more hidden biblical truths that challenge conventional understanding. The story we are about to unfold will take you from the shores of Galilee to the far reaches of the Roman Empire. We will examine archaeological evidence, explore ancient texts outside the traditional Bible, and investigate the controversial debates surrounding these martyrdoms. Each apostle's story contains unique elements that reveal different aspects of early Christianities spread across the ancient world. But before we meet each apostle individually, we must understand the world they inhabited. The Roman Empire controlled most of the known world through military might and political sophistication. Roman law dominated daily life. Roman gods filled public temples. Roman culture influenced everything from commerce to entertainment. Into this overwhelming system stepped 12 men with a message that contradicted everything Rome represented. They proclaimed that a crucified Jewish teacher, not Caesar, was the true Lord. They announced that an invisible kingdom, not Rome's military power, would ultimately triumph. They insisted that love and sacrifice, not conquest and domination, revealed the character of true divinity. The Romans had a standard response to such challenges: crucifixion. This execution method served as public spectacle and political warning. Crosses lined major roads leading into cities, displaying the consequences of defying Rome. The process was designed to maximize suffering and humiliation. Victims often survived for days, slowly suffocating as their bodies weakened. The message was clear: this is what happens to those who challenge Roman authority. Yet the apostles walked directly into this system, fully aware of the consequences, and proclaimed their message anyway. Jewish authorities also opposed the apostolic message, though for different reasons. To them, the claim that Jesus was the Messiah represented blasphemy. The idea that God would become human, die on a cross, and rise again contradicted their theological understanding. The notion that Gentiles could enter God's covenant without fully adopting Jewish law threatened their religious identity. The apostles faced opposition not just from pagan Rome, but from their own religious community, caught between two powerful forces determined to silence them. What kept them going? Ancient letters written by these men provide insight. Paul, though not one of the original 12, wrote extensively about his motivations. He described the resurrection appearances in detail, noting that over 500 people claimed to have seen the risen Jesus at once. He challenged his readers to investigate these claims, noting that most of these witnesses were still alive and could be questioned. This was not the language of myth-making. This was the language of someone staking his life on verifiable events. The apostles also possessed something their opponents lacked. They had nothing to gain and everything to lose. They gained no wealth, no political power, no social status. They endured beatings, imprisonment, and execution. If they were fabricating a story, their reward system makes no sense. But if they genuinely believed they had encountered the risen Christ, their behavior becomes perfectly logical. They acted like witnesses, not like con artists. They testified like people who had seen something undeniable, regardless of consequences. As we prepare to examine each apostle's final journey, one question looms larger than all others. Could 12 independent men, scattered across thousands of miles, facing different executioners in different cultures, all maintain the same lie until death? or does their consistent testimony, confirmed by hostile historical sources and supported by archaeological evidence, point to something they genuinely experienced? The answer to that question has implications far beyond ancient history. It touches the foundation of the world's largest faith and challenges our understanding of what evidence really means. Chapter 2. Fishermen who changed history. The 12 apostles came from remarkably ordinary backgrounds. No kings, no priests, no scholars filled their rank. Instead, Jesus chose fishermen, a tax collector, a political radical, and various working-class individuals whose names history would have forgotten if not for their connection to the Nazarene teacher. This selection itself raised eyebrows among the religious elite of Jerusalem. Rabbis typically chose the brightest students from established families. Jesus chose men who smelled like fish and counted coins for Rome. Peter, Andrew, James, and John were commercial fishermen from Capernaum, a small town on the Sea of Galilee. Archaeological excavations have uncovered first-century fishing villages around this lake, revealing the lifestyle these men would have known. They were not poor peasants but skilled laborers who owned boats and employed workers. Their families had established fishing businesses that provided stable income. When Jesus called them to follow him, they abandoned economic security for an uncertain future, wandering the dusty roads of Palestine. Matthew worked as a tax collector, one of the most despised occupations in Jewish society. Tax collectors were viewed as traitors who enriched themselves by collaborating with Roman occupation forces. They frequently charged more than required and pocketed the difference. Matthew's profession meant he was likely excluded from synagogue worship and social gatherings. Respectable Jews avoided contact with tax collectors, considering them ritually unclean. Yet Jesus not only spoke to Matthew, but called him to join the inner circle of disciples, scandalizing religious observers. Simon the Zealot presented a different kind of controversial choice. The Zealots were a radical political movement committed to overthrowing Roman occupation through violence if necessary. They assassinated Roman collaborators, attacked military outposts, and plotted rebellion. Including a zealot among the 12 placed the entire group under Roman suspicion. Security forces monitored such individuals closely, yet Jesus chose Simon anyway, creating a group that included both a Roman collaborator, Matthew, and a Roman resistor, Simon, forcing them to coexist and cooperate. The remaining apostles came from similarly unremarkable backgrounds. Philip came from Bethsaida, the same fishing town as Peter and Andrew. Bartholomew, also called Nathanael, was likely a farmer or agricultural worker. Thomas's profession remains unknown, though tradition suggests he was a builder. James the Less, Thaddeus, and the other lesser-known apostles left few biographical details, suggesting they were common laborers without notable accomplishments before meeting Jesus. Why would Jesus choose such unlikely candidates? Religious authorities pointed to the apostles' lack of formal training as evidence that Jesus himself was unqualified. How could unschooled fishermen understand complex theological concepts? How could men without rabbinic training interpret scripture? The Jewish religious system depended on years of study under approved teachers. The apostles had bypassed this entire system, learning instead from an unauthorized rabbi who regularly violated traditional interpretations. Yet this apparent weakness became a strategic strength. The apostles could not be dismissed as ambitious religious professionals seeking power and position. They had no institutional credentials to protect and no theological reputations to defend. Their testimony carried the weight of ordinary people describing extraordinary events. When sophisticated philosophers and trained rhetoricians later encountered Christianity, they found not elaborate theological arguments but simple testimony from working-class individuals who claimed to have witnessed the impossible. The relationship between Jesus and his chosen 12 evolved over 3 years of intensive travel and teaching. They watched him interact with prostitutes and Pharisees, lepers and lawyers, children and centurions. They witnessed his compassion toward outcasts and his fierce confrontations with religious hypocrites. They saw him weep at a friend's tomb and rage at corruption in the temple. They knew him not as a distant religious figure, but as a daily companion who ate meals, told jokes, and slept under the same stars. This intimate knowledge made their later testimony particularly compelling. They could describe specific conversations, quirks of personality, and private moments that only close associates would know. When they later proclaimed his resurrection, they spoke not as distant admirers repeating rumors, but as friends describing a person they knew intimately. The gospel accounts include embarrassing details about the apostles' own failures and misunderstandings, suggesting eyewitness testimony rather than idealized legend. The diversity within the 12 also created a microcosm of the movement that would follow. Jews and Gentiles, educated and uneducated, wealthy and poor, would all find places in the expanding community. The fact that a tax collector and a zealot could work together demonstrated that Christ's message transcended the political and social divisions that typically fragmented society. If these unlikely individuals could form a unified team, perhaps the seemingly impossible dream of human reconciliation across all boundaries was not so impossible after all. But their time together was limited. After 3 years of teaching, Jesus began preparing them for his departure. He spoke repeatedly about his coming death, though they struggled to understand. He warned them they would face persecution and death themselves. He promised that his Spirit would empower them to continue his mission after he was gone. These predictions must have seemed abstract and distant as long as Jesus walked beside them. Only after his crucifixion and resurrection would they understand the true cost of discipleship. The transformation from students to apostles occurred gradually. During Jesus' ministry, they were learners, observers, occasionally participating in healings and teaching, but always under his direct supervision. After the resurrection and ascension, they became the primary witnesses, the authoritative voices, the leaders of a movement that would explode across the Mediterranean world. The book of Acts describes their bold preaching in Jerusalem, their miraculous healings, their confrontations with authorities who had recently executed their master. Like this revelation if it surprises you, and make sure you are subscribed, because what happens to these ordinary men will demonstrate extraordinary courage. Their transformation from frightened deserters to fearless martyrs raises questions that historians and skeptics still debate. What changed in those few days between the crucifixion and their public re-emergence? What could possibly explain the complete reversal in their behavior? As we follow their individual journeys, we will see that each apostle faced unique circumstances that tested their commitment in different ways. Chapter 3. The Rock Who Denied and Died Upside Down. Simon Peter stands as perhaps the most complex and relatable of all the apostles. Jesus nicknamed him the Rock, yet Peter displayed a volatile personality that swung between bold faith and crushing failure. He walked on water until he doubted and began to sink. He declared Jesus to be the Christ, then immediately earned a rebuke for opposing God's plan. He promised to die for his master, then denied knowing him before the rooster crowed. If any apostle seemed likely to abandon the faith, Peter was the obvious candidate. Yet this same Peter became the primary spokesman for the early church. On the day of Pentecost, just weeks after Jesus' ascension, Peter stood before thousands of Jewish pilgrims in Jerusalem and boldly proclaimed that they had crucified their Messiah. This was not a safe message. The religious authorities who had orchestrated Jesus' execution still held power. Roman soldiers still patrolled the streets. The crowd included people who had shouted for Jesus' crucifixion. Yet Peter spoke without hesitation, accusing them of murdering the Son of God and calling them to repentance. The boldness was remarkable, but the response was even more astonishing. Ancient records indicate that about 3,000 people believed Peter's message and were baptized that day. Within weeks, the number grew to 5,000 men, not counting women and children. The movement Jesus had started with 12 followers was exploding exponentially. The religious authorities who thought they had crushed this sect by executing its leader now faced a crisis as thousands of Jerusalem residents embraced the resurrection message. Peter's leadership during these early years demonstrated courage that seemed impossible for the man who had denied Jesus. He and John were arrested for healing a lame man at the temple gate. When the Sanhedrin ordered them to stop preaching about Jesus, Peter responded with defiant clarity. "Whether it is right to obey God or men, you decide, but we cannot help speaking about what we have seen and heard." This was not religious fanaticism. This was eyewitness testimony from someone who could not be silenced. The authorities flogged them and released them with stern warnings. Peter and John returned to the community of believers, not discouraged, but rejoicing that they had been counted worthy to suffer for the name of Jesus. This response reveals something crucial about their psychology. They were not seeking martyrdom as an end in itself. They were willing to endure suffering because they possessed certainty about what they had witnessed. Their behavior matched that of people who had seen undeniable truth, not that of people maintaining a comfortable lie. Peter's missionary work eventually took him beyond Jerusalem to various cities across the Roman Empire. Tradition holds that he traveled to Antioch, Corinth, and eventually Rome itself. Ancient Christian writings reference Peter's presence in Rome during the reign of Emperor Nero, establishing churches and teaching converts in the heart of the empire that had executed his master. This required extraordinary courage. Rome was the center of imperial power, the source of the military machine that had crucified Jesus, yet Peter walked into this stronghold and proclaimed that Caesar was not Lord, Christ was. The year 64 AD brought catastrophe to Rome and opportunity to Nero. A massive fire consumed large sections of the city, destroying homes and displacing thousands. Rumors circulated that Nero himself had ordered the fire to clear space for his building projects. To deflect blame, Nero needed a scapegoat. He found one in the Christian community. Roman historian Tacitus described how Nero blamed Christians for the fire, initiating a persecution so brutal that even Romans accustomed to gladiatorial violence found it excessive. Christians were arrested en masse. Some were sewn into animal skins and torn apart by dogs in public arenas. Others were covered in pitch and set on fire to illuminate Nero's gardens at night. Crucifixions became daily spectacles. Into this nightmare, Peter continued preaching, now knowing that arrest meant certain death. Ancient Christian tradition holds that believers urged Peter to flee the city to preserve his life and leadership for the growing church. Peter initially agreed and left Rome, but a legendary encounter changed his mind. As he traveled the Appian Way away from the city, tradition says he encountered a vision of Jesus heading toward Rome. Peter asked, "Quo vadis, Domine?" meaning, "Where are you going, Lord?" Jesus replied, "I am going to Rome to be crucified again." Understanding this as a rebuke for abandoning the Roman Christians, Peter turned back towards certain martyrdom. Roman soldiers eventually arrested Peter. He was sentenced to crucifixion, the same death his master had suffered. But here the story takes a remarkable turn. Ancient sources, including the church historian Eusebius writing in the 4th century and the apocryphal Acts of Peter written in the 2nd century, record that Peter made a final request. He asked to be crucified upside down, claiming he was unworthy to die in the same manner as Christ. Some modern scholars question whether this detail is historical or legendary embellishment. However, the story appears in multiple independent sources from the early church, suggesting it preserves authentic tradition. Whether the upside-down crucifixion actually occurred or represents symbolic truth, the story reveals how early Christians understood Peter's character. Even at the moment of execution, he demonstrated humility and reverence for his master. The location of Peter's execution and burial became a site of pilgrimage for early Christians. 4th century Emperor Constantine built the first St. Peter's Basilica over what was believed to be Peter's tomb. Archaeological excavations beneath the current St. Minth, Peter's Basilica in the 20th century, discovered a 1st century cemetery and bones that some researchers believe could be Peter's remains. While definitive identification is impossible, the archaeological evidence confirms that early Christians believed Peter was buried at this specific location. Peter's martyrdom raises compelling questions about human psychology and the nature of conviction. This was the same man who had denied Jesus to save his own skin during a moment of danger. Yet when faced with execution decades later, he refused to recant. What changed? Psychological research shows that humans have remarkable capacity for self-deception. but maintaining a false belief under torture and execution is extraordinarily rare. People break, they confess, they bargain. That Peter went to his death refusing to deny Christ suggests he possessed certainty that transcended normal human fear. The impact of Peter's death rippled through the early church. Rather than discouraging believers, his martyrdom inspired them. The witness of a leader choosing death over denial strengthened the resolve of others facing persecution. His example demonstrated that faith in the resurrection was not merely intellectual belief, but conviction worth dying for. The church in Rome, despite losing its primary leader, continued to grow even during Nero's persecution. Comment below your thoughts on what could transform a denier into a martyr. What evidence could possibly provide that level of certainty? Peter's journey from failure to faithfulness challenges simple explanations. Psychological pressure typically breaks false witnesses, yet Peter remained unshakable when torture and death arrived. His transformation represents either the greatest example of self-deception in history or genuine encounter with something that eliminated all doubt. Chapter 4. The X-shaped cross of Andrew. Andrew was Peter's brother, but while Peter often took center stage, Andrew worked quietly in the background. He appears less frequently in gospel accounts, yet ancient traditions credit him with remarkable missionary journeys that took Christianity to regions far beyond Jerusalem. Andrew represents the countless faithful servants whose work expanded the early church without seeking recognition or glory. The Gospel of John records that Andrew was actually the first disciple called by Jesus. He had been following John the Baptist when the Baptist pointed to Jesus and declared, "Behold, the Lamb of God." Andrew immediately followed Jesus, spent time with him, and then rushed to find his brother Peter with the announcement, "We have found the Messiah." This pattern defined Andrew's ministry, encountering truth and immediately sharing it with others. He was a connector, an introducer, someone who brought people to Jesus rather than drawing attention to himself. Another gospel account highlights Andrew's practical nature. When Jesus asked the disciples how to feed the 5,000 people who had gathered to hear him teach, it was Andrew who found the boy with 5 loaves and 2 fish. Andrew pragmatically noted that this amount was insufficient for the crowd, but he presented what was available anyway. His action demonstrated both practical assessment and faith that Jesus could work with inadequate resources. After Jesus' ascension, Andrew embarked on missionary journeys that ancient church traditions track through Scythia, Greece, Asia Minor, and possibly regions around the Black Sea. Some traditions even claim he reached as far as Kiev in modern Ukraine and Novgorod in Russia, making him a patron saint of both Scotland and Russia despite never visiting either location according to most historical evidence. These traditions may conflate different missionaries named Andrew, but they demonstrate the wide geographical impact early apostles had on spreading Christianity. The most detailed traditions place Andrew's final years in Greece, particularly in Patras, a significant port city in Achaea. Here, Andrew performed healings and conversions that attracted large crowds. Ancient texts describe how Andrew healed the wife of Agete, the Roman governor of the region, converting her to Christianity. This healing and conversion infuriated Agete, who saw Christianity as a threat to Roman religious customs and his own authority. The conflict between Andrew and Agete represents the larger collision between early Christianity and Roman power. Rome maintained control partly through religious conformity. Emperor worship and traditional Roman gods provided ideological unity across the diverse empire. Christianity rejected these practices, refusing to offer sacrifices to Roman gods or acknowledge Caesar's divinity. This was not merely religious disagreement, but political rebellion in Roman eyes. Christians were atheists to Romans because they denied the gods, and they were traitors because they rejected Caesar's ultimate authority. When Andrew refused to sacrifice to Roman gods and continued preaching Christ, Aegeates ordered his arrest. Ancient accounts, particularly the apocryphal Acts of Andrew written in the 2nd or 3rd century, provide details that may blend history and legend. These texts describe Andrew's trial before Aegeates, where the apostle boldly proclaimed Christ crucified and rejected the governor's threats. Aegeates, unable to force Andrew's compliance, sentenced him to crucifixion. The tradition of Andrew's X-shaped cross comes from these ancient sources. Multiple accounts claim that Andrew was bound, not nailed, to a cross shaped like the letter X. This particular form of cross, now called a saltire or St. Andrew's cross, was supposedly chosen to distinguish Andrew's death from Christ's crucifixion. Some historians question whether this detail is historical or symbolic, noting that crucifixion methods varied and the X shape may have been a later artistic convention rather than historical fact. What remains historically plausible is that Andrew was indeed martyred in Greece during the 1st century. The early church unanimously testified to his martyrdom, and no contradictory traditions exist suggesting he died peacefully. Ancient texts describe how Andrew hung on his cross for 2 days, preaching to gathered crowds until he died. This detail, if accurate, reveals remarkable endurance and commitment. Rather than pleading for release or cursing his executioners, he used his dying moments to proclaim his message. The 2-day time frame is medically plausible for crucifixion by binding rather than nailing. When victims were tied to crosses, death came slowly from exposure, exhaustion, and inability to properly breathe as muscles weakened. The process could take several days, creating extended public spectacles that served as warnings to others. That Andrew supposedly preached during this suffering demonstrates extraordinary dedication to his mission, even while experiencing agonizing death. The location of Andrew's martyrdom and burial became significant for early Christian communities. Patras maintained traditions about Andrew's presence and death, with churches built over sites associated with him. In the 4th century, Emperor Constantine's son Constantius supposedly transferred some of Andrew's remains to Constantinople, the new Christian capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. Later traditions claim other portions were moved to Scotland, establishing Andrew as that nation's patron saint and explaining the X-shaped cross on the Scottish flag. These relic translations, while historically questionable in their details, demonstrate how important the apostles' physical remains became for early Christians. Possessing a martyr's bones connected a community to the apostolic age and provided tangible links to Christianity's origins. Cities competed for apostolic connections, sometimes creating elaborate legends about visits and burials. Separating historical facts from later embellishments remains challenging, but the core tradition of Andrew's martyrdom in Greece maintains strong historical support. Andrew's story illustrates how early Christianity spread through personal networks and individual dedication rather than institutional power. He was not a trained orator or influential politician. He was a fisherman who met Jesus, believed the message, and spent the rest of his life introducing others to what he had found. His willingness to die rather than recant suggests he possessed certainty about his testimony. People rarely die for what they know is false, especially when simple recantation would save their lives. The contrast between Andrew's ordinary origins and extraordinary impact challenges assumptions about influence and legacy. History remembers conquerors, emperors, and philosophers, yet Andrew the fisherman helped establish a movement that outlasted the Roman Empire itself. His legacy lives in churches scattered across Greece, in the Scottish flag, in Russian Orthodox traditions, and in the broader Christian faith that traces its origins to eyewitnesses like him. Share this video with others interested in the historical foundations of Christianity. Andrew's story demonstrates how ordinary individuals became part of an extraordinary movement that transformed civilization. His choice to face crucifixion rather than deny his testimony raises the same question Peter's death presented: what evidence could convince someone so thoroughly that they would accept execution rather than simply admit error? The answer matters not just for understanding ancient history, but for evaluating the truth claims at Christianity's foundation. Chapter 5. James, first blood of the apostles. James, son of Zebedee, holds a unique distinction among the 12 apostles. He was the first to be martyred, and his death is the only apostolic martyrdom recorded in the New Testament itself. The book of Acts states simply that King Herod had James, the brother of John, killed with the sword. This brief verse carries enormous historical significance, providing solid biblical documentation for at least one apostolic martyrdom and establishing the pattern of persecution that would claim all but one of the original 12. James and his brother John were fishing partners with Peter and Andrew before Jesus called them. The Gospels nickname them Sons of Thunder, suggesting forceful personalities and perhaps quick tempers. This nickname proved appropriate when James and John asked Jesus if they should call fire down from heaven to destroy a Samaritan village that refused to welcome them. Jesus rebuked their vindictive suggestion, but the incident reveals their passionate natures. The brothers also demonstrated ambition that sometimes conflicted with Jesus' teachings about servanthood. Their mother approached Jesus requesting that her 2 sons be granted the places of highest honor in his kingdom, sitting at his right and left hand when he came into his glory. This request annoyed the other disciples and prompted Jesus to teach that greatness in his kingdom meant service, not dominance. He asked James and John if they were able to drink the cup he would drink, referring to his coming suffering. They confidently replied that they were able, not yet understanding what that claim would cost. Despite these imperfect moments, James was among the 3 apostles Jesus selected for special experiences. Peter, James, and John witnessed Jesus raising Jairus' daughter from death. They alone accompanied Jesus up the mountain where the transfiguration occurred, seeing him conversing with Moses and Elijah in radiant glory. They were the 3 Jesus asked to stay close and pray with him in the Garden of Gethsemane before his arrest. These experiences gave James unique insight into Jesus' identity and mission. After Jesus' ascension, James appears to have remained in Jerusalem with the other apostles, helping to establish and lead the growing church. The book of Acts describes the explosive growth of the Christian community in Jerusalem, despite opposition from religious authorities. Thousands converted and formed a close-knit community that shared possessions and met daily for teaching and fellowship. James would have been among the primary leaders guiding this community through its formative period. The political situation in Jerusalem remained volatile. The Jewish religious establishment viewed the Christian movement as heretical, while Romans saw it as potentially seditious. King Herod Agrippa I, grandson of the Herod who had tried to kill Jesus as an infant, ruled Judea as a client king under Roman authority from 41 to 44 AD. Herod Agrippa sought to maintain good relations with Jewish religious leaders, and he recognized that persecuting Christians would earn their approval. The book of Acts records that around 44 AD, Herod Agrippa began persecuting church leaders. He arrested James, son of Zebedee, and executed him by sword, likely meaning beheading. This method was typically reserved for Roman citizens and distinguished prisoners, suggesting Herod treated James as a significant threat rather than a common criminal. The execution pleased Jewish religious leaders, encouraging Herod to arrest Peter as well, though Peter's miraculous escape from prison prevented his execution at that time. James's martyrdom marked a crucial turning point for the early church. He was the first apostle to fulfill Jesus' prediction that they would drink from the same cup of suffering. His death demonstrated that following Christ could have fatal consequences, even in Jerusalem where the movement began. Yet rather than discouraging believers, James's martyrdom seemed to strengthen their resolve. The church continued growing despite increased persecution, suggesting that witnessing a leader choose death over denial reinforced believers' confidence in the resurrection message. Ancient traditions beyond the biblical account add details that may blend history and legend. Some sources claim that James's accuser was so moved by the apostles' courage during trial that he converted to Christianity on the spot and was executed alongside James. This story appears in the writings of early church historian Eusebius, who cited even earlier sources. While impossible to verify, the story illustrates how James's testimony impacted even those sent to condemn him. Another significant tradition claims that James preached in Spain before returning to Jerusalem, where he was martyred. This tradition developed later and lacks strong historical support, but it became so influential that Santiago de Compostela in Spain became one of Christianity's most important pilgrimage sites. Millions have walked the Camino de Santiago over the centuries, following routes believed to lead to James's burial place, Whether or not James actually visited Spain, the pilgrimage tradition demonstrates his enduring impact on Christian spirituality and devotion. The historical core remains clear even if some details are uncertain. James was executed around 44 AD by order of Herod Agrippa. This execution is documented in the Book of Acts, written within decades of the event and circulated among people who could verify or challenge its claims. The execution pleased Jewish religious authorities, suggesting James was viewed as a threat to established religious power. James refused to recant his testimony about Jesus' resurrection even when faced with execution. James's choice raises the same psychological question other apostolic martyrdoms present. He could have escaped death by denying Jesus or fleeing Jerusalem. Neither option required elaborate explanation. He could have claimed he was mistaken about the resurrection or that he had been deceived. Instead, he apparently went to his execution maintaining his testimony. This behavior aligns with that of someone who possessed certainty based on personal experience, not someone maintaining a comfortable fiction. The fact that James's martyrdom pleased Jewish religious authorities suggests they viewed the Christian movement as a serious threat by the mid-40s AD. If Christianity had been obviously false, if the resurrection claims were easily debunked, religious authorities could have simply presented evidence to discredit the movement. Instead, they resorted to executing leaders, suggesting they had no compelling evidence to disprove the apostolic testimony and relied on violence to suppress the message. James's death also reveals something about the nature of the early Christian community. They were not seeking martyrdom as an end in itself. The Book of Acts describes how believers prayed fervently for Peter's release from prison after James's execution. They wanted their leaders to survive and continue guiding the community. Yet when martyrdom came, they accepted it as the potential cost of faithfulness. They grieved James's death while simultaneously celebrating his faithfulness unto death. The impact of being the first apostolic martyr gave James a special place in Christian memory. His willingness to die rather than deny his testimony about the resurrection became a foundational example for subsequent generations facing persecution. If the first apostle to face execution had recanted, it would have shattered confidence in the resurrection message. That he went to his death maintaining his testimony strengthened the resolve of others facing similar choices. Like this video, if the historical evidence for apostolic martyrdom surprises you, James's story is unique among the 12 because it is documented in Scripture itself, not just in later church tradition. This biblical record provides a solid foundation for understanding that at least some of the apostles did indeed face execution for their testimony. While we will examine traditions about the other apostles' deaths, James's martyrdom stands on the firmest historical ground, anchoring our understanding of the price these early witnesses paid for their message. Chapter 6. John the Apostle. Death couldn't kill John, son of Zebedee, stands as the great exception among the 12 apostles. While his 11 companions met violent ends, ancient traditions unanimously report that John died naturally in old age. Yet this does not mean he avoided persecution. According to early church records, John survived multiple execution attempts in ways that seem miraculous, leading to his exile rather than death. His story demonstrates that faithfulness sometimes means enduring decades of service rather than accepting quick martyrdom. John was James's brother, the other son of thunder, who witnessed the transfiguration and prayed in Gethsemane. But John's personality differed from his impetuous brother. The gospel bearing John's name repeatedly refers to him as the disciple whom Jesus loved, suggesting a particularly close relationship. At the Last Supper, John reclined next to Jesus. At the crucifixion, Jesus entrusted his mother Mary to John's care, and John took her into his home. These details paint John as contemplative, devoted, and trusted with Jesus' most intimate concerns. After Jesus' ascension, John became a pillar of the Jerusalem church alongside Peter and James, the brother of Jesus. Paul's letter to the Galatians mentions these three as recognized leaders who extended the right hand of fellowship to Paul's mission to the Gentiles. John apparently remained in Jerusalem for many years, helping to establish the theological and organizational foundations of the growing movement. His eyewitness testimony carried enormous weight in a community debating how to understand Jesus' identity and message. Tradition holds that John eventually relocated to Ephesus, a major city in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. Ephesus was a significant cultural and commercial center, home to the Temple of Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Establishing a Christian presence in such a pagan stronghold required courage and persistence. Ancient sources describe John as an elderly leader by this time, guiding a network of churches throughout the region and training younger leaders to continue the apostolic mission. The most dramatic episode in John's story involves Emperor Domitian, who ruled Rome from 81 to 96 AD. Domitian demanded to be addressed as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, requiring divine honors that Christians could not offer. His reign brought renewed persecution of Christians who refused to participate in emperor worship. John's prominence as an apostolic eyewitness and leader made him a prime target. According to the church historian Tertullian, writing in the late 2nd or early 3rd century, Roman authorities attempted to execute John by plunging him into boiling oil. This would have been a horrific death, causing extreme pain before killing the victim. Yet, Tertullian reports that John emerged unharmed, his survival interpreted as divine protection. Unable to execute John, yet unwilling to release him, authorities exiled him to Patmos, a small rocky island used for banishing political prisoners and criminals. Modern historians debate whether the boiling oil incident is historical fact or legendary embellishment. Tertullian wrote over a century after the alleged event, leaving room for legendary development. However, the core tradition of John's exile to Patmos under Domitian's persecution appears in multiple independent sources and is generally accepted as historical. The island of Patmos itself maintains traditions about John's presence, with sites identified as connected to his time there. Patmos was far from paradise. This small, barren island offered little comfort to exiles who likely performed hard labor in quarries or mines. Yet John's exile became extraordinarily productive. According to Christian tradition, while on Patmos, John received the visions that became the Book of Revelation, the final book of the Christian Bible. This apocalyptic text, full of symbolic imagery and prophetic messages, has fascinated and puzzled readers for 2 millennia. The Book of Revelation addresses 7 churches in Asia Minor, suggesting John maintained contact with the communities he had shepherded before his exile. The text speaks into a context of persecution, offering hope that God would ultimately triumph over oppressive earthly powers. The vivid imagery of cosmic conflict between good and evil, the descriptions of divine judgment and ultimate restoration, and the promise of a new heaven and new earth provided encouragement to suffering Christians while establishing themes that would shape Christian theology for centuries. After Domitian's death in 96 AD, his successor Nerva reportedly released political and religious prisoners, allowing John to return to Ephesus. By this time, John would have been very elderly, perhaps in his 80s or 90s. Yet he resumed his leadership role, continuing to teach and guide the churches. Tradition credits John with writing not only the Book of Revelation, but also the Gospel of John and 3 epistles bearing his name, though scholars debate the exact authorship and dating of these texts. Ancient writers describe the elderly John as being carried into church gatherings when he was too weak to walk. When asked to address the assembled believers, tradition says he would simply repeat, "Little children, love one another." When people asked why he always said the same thing, John reportedly replied, "Because it is the Lord's command, and if this alone is done, it is enough." This tradition, whether historically precise or not, captures how early Christians remembered John's emphasis on love as the core of Christian practice. The early church father Irenaeus, who knew Polycarp, who had known John personally, reported that John lived into the reign of Emperor Trajan, who began ruling in 98 AD. This would make John approximately 90 to 100 years old at his death. He was the last surviving eyewitness of Jesus' ministry, the final apostle who could say, "I was there, I saw him, I heard him, I touched him after he rose from the dead." John's death by natural causes after decades of faithful service raises interesting questions about martyrdom and faithfulness. The other apostles died violently after relatively brief ministries. John endured for decades, facing exile and persecution but ultimately dying in old age. Was his long life a reward for faithfulness or simply God's different plan for different servants? Early Christians did not view John's natural death as less valuable than his brother James's martyrdom. Both demonstrated faithfulness, one through quick sacrifice, the other through persistent endurance. John's writings deeply influenced Christian theology. The Gospel of John opens with profound philosophical claims about Jesus as the eternal Word through whom all things were made. The epistles emphasize love as the defining characteristic of those who know God. The Book of Revelation provides symbolic vocabulary for understanding cosmic conflict and divine victory. Together, these texts shaped how Christians understand Jesus' identity, the nature of genuine faith, and God's ultimate purposes for creation. The ruins of ancient Ephesus preserve evidence of early Christian presence in the city. Archaeologists have identified the traditional site of John's tomb, located on a hill outside the ancient city, while the current structure is a later Byzantine church built over the presumed burial site. The tradition of John's burial in Ephesus dates back to at least the 2nd century. This archaeological and traditional evidence supports the claim that John indeed spent his final years in this region. John's unique story among the 12 demonstrates that faithfulness takes many forms. Some were called to quick martyrdom, others to decades of persistent service. Some traveled widely, others focused on specific regions. Some produced written testimonies that shape doctrine, others left only oral traditions about their missions. The diversity of their experiences suggests that genuine faith expresses itself in varied ways depending on circumstances and calling. Comment your thoughts on why John alone survived while his companions were martyred. Was it simply chance, divine protection, or perhaps the need for at least one eyewitness to survive long enough to produce written testimonies? John's longevity allowed him to guide the church through crucial formative decades and to counter emerging heresies with apostolic authority. His survival served purposes different from but equally important as his companions' martyrdoms. Chapter 7. Philip and the Serban Temple. Philip the Apostle remains one of the more mysterious members of the 12. He should not be confused with Philip the Evangelist, who appears in Acts as one of the 7 deacons chosen to serve the Jerusalem church. Philip the Apostle receives limited attention in Gospel accounts, yet ancient traditions credit him with remarkable missionary work in regions that would become crucial for Christianity's spread. The Gospel of John provides the most information about Philip among the canonical texts. He came from Bethsaida, the same fishing town as Peter and Andrew. Jesus called Philip directly, and Philip immediately found his friend Nathanael, likely the same person as Bartholomew, and told him, "We have found the one Moses wrote about in the law, and about whom the prophets also wrote." When Nathanael expressed skepticism, Philip gave a simple invitation: "Come and see." This pattern of encountering Jesus and then bringing others to meet him characterized Philip's approach throughout the Gospels. Philip appears again during the feeding of the 5,000. Jesus tested Philip by asking where they could buy bread to feed the large crowd. Philip responded pragmatically that 8 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each person to have a small portion. His answer demonstrated practical thinking, but perhaps limited faith in Jesus' ability to work with inadequate resources. Jesus then proceeded to multiply 5 loaves and 2 fish to feed the entire crowd with 12 baskets of leftovers. At the Last Supper, Philip made a request that has resonated with believers ever since. After Jesus spoke about knowing and seeing the Father, Philip said, "Lord, show us the Father, and that will be enough for us." Jesus responded with gentle rebuke. "Have I been with you so long, and you still do not know me, Philip? Whoever has seen me has seen the Father." This exchange reveals both Philip's honest seeking and his occasional slowness to grasp Jesus' deepest teachings about his identity. After Jesus' ascension, Philip disappears from biblical accounts. However, early church traditions describe his missionary journeys through Asia Minor, particularly in the regions of Phrygia and Hierapolis. These traditions appear in various ancient sources, including the writings of Polycrates, bishop of Ephesus in the late 2nd century, who mentions Philip's burial in Hierapolis. The apocryphal Acts of Philip, written in the 4th century or later, provides colorful details about Philip's ministry, though historians caution that these texts blend history with legend. Hierapolis was located in what is now southwestern Turkey, near the modern city of Pamukkale. The ancient city was famous for its hot springs and travertine terraces. It was also home to a major pagan temple associated with the god Apollo and the plutonium, a cave that emitted poisonous gases believed to be an entrance to the underworld. Priests of Cybele kept sacred snakes in the temple, and eunuch priests practiced ecstatic rituals that included self-mutilation. Into this environment of mystery religions and pagan worship, Philip brought the message of Christ. Ancient accounts describe Philip performing miracles and converting many residents of Hierapolis to Christianity. These conversions threatened the economic interests of pagan priests and the cultural identity of residents invested in the traditional religious system. The Snake Temple in particular became a focus of conflict. Some traditions claim Philip confronted the pagan priests directly, challenging the power of their serpent deity. When the snake allegedly died or disappeared after Philip's prayers, it provoked outrage among the devotees. The apocryphal Acts of Philip provides dramatic narrative details that may be more legend than history. According to this text, Philip and Bartholomew traveled together and faced opposition from pagans. Philip was arrested along with Bartholomew and sentenced to death by crucifixion. The text describes Philip being hung upside down by his ankles on an X-shaped cross, similar to Andrew's traditional martyrdom. However, the account then claims that an earthquake occurred, causing fear among the executioners. Bartholomew supposedly survived, but Philip, already near death, refused rescue and died as a martyr. Modern scholars treat this narrative cautiously. The Acts of Philip is a late text written centuries after the events it describes, and it contains elements that seem designed to dramatize and theologize rather than record history. However, the core tradition that Philip died as a martyr in Hierapolis appears in earlier sources and is more widely accepted. The exact method of execution remains uncertain, but crucifixion, hanging, or stoning were all common forms of execution for perceived troublemakers in the Roman Empire. Archaeological discoveries at Hierapolis have provided fascinating physical evidence related to Philip traditions. Italian archaeologists announced in 2011 that they had discovered what they believe is Philip's tomb at the ancient site. The structure dates to the appropriate period and matches descriptions from ancient sources about Philip's burial place. While the tomb is now empty and positive identification is impossible, the discovery confirms that early Christians venerated this specific location as connected to Philip. The ancient church at Hierapolis became a significant Christian center, partly due to its association with Philip. By the 4th century, the city had a substantial Christian population and an impressive church structure built near the believed site of Philip's martyrdom. Pilgrims traveled to Hierapolis to honor Philip's memory, making it part of the network of sacred sites that connected the Christian world to its apostolic origins. Philip's mission to Hierapolis illustrates the strategy of early Christian expansion. Apostles and missionaries targeted significant urban centers where successful evangelism could create ripple effects throughout surrounding regions. Hierapolis was not an isolated village but a prosperous city with connections throughout the region. Converting residents of such cities established bases from which Christianity could spread along trade routes and through family networks. The conflict with the Snake Temple, whether historical in its details or symbolic in its meaning, represents the larger confrontation between Christianity and pagan religions. Early Christians did not seek peaceful coexistence with other religious systems. They proclaimed Christ as the exclusive way to God, rejecting the validity of pagan deities. This exclusivism brought them into conflict with established religious institutions and with Roman policies that generally accommodated diverse religious practices as long as they did not threaten social stability. Philip's reported willingness to die rather than compromise his message follows the pattern of other apostolic martyrdoms. If the resurrection was a fabrication, Philip could have recanted when faced with execution. He could have claimed he was mistaken or deceived. The fact that he apparently chose death suggests he possessed certainty about his testimony based on personal experience. While we should distinguish between what we can historically verify and what depends on tradition, the consistent pattern of apostolic martyrdom across different sources and regions provides cumulative evidence that these men truly believed they had encountered the risen Christ. The traditional date of Philip's martyrdom places it around 80 AD, during the reign of Emperor Domitian. This was a period of sporadic persecution of Christians, particularly in Asia Minor, where emperor worship was strongly promoted. Christians who refused to offer sacrifices to the emperor faced charges of treason and impiety. Philip's execution likely resulted from this conflict between Christian exclusivism and Roman religious expectations. Philip's legacy continued long after his death. The Christians of Hierapolis maintained his memory, making his tomb a pilgrimage site. His example of faithfulness unto death encouraged believers facing persecution in subsequent centuries. His simple invitation to Nathanael, "Come and see," became a model for evangelism focused on personal encounter rather than abstract argument. Though less famous than Peter or John, Philip contributed significantly to Christianity's spread into Asia Minor, a region that would become central to Christian theology and church development in the following centuries. Share this video with others interested in how Christianity spread beyond Jerusalem. Philip's story demonstrates that the apostolic mission extended into regions practicing very different religious traditions. His confrontation with pagan temples and his reported martyrdom show the high cost of establishing Christianity in cultures deeply invested in their traditional religions. The archaeological evidence from Hierapolis provides tangible connection to these ancient events, reminding us that these stories unfolded in real places among real people, facing genuine choices about faith and survival. Chapter 8. Bartholomew, flayed alive for faith. Bartholomew remains one of the most enigmatic of the 12 apostles, yet traditions about his death describe one of the most horrific martyrdoms in Christian history. Most scholars identify Bartholomew with Nathanael, the disciple Philip brought to Jesus. The Gospel of John records their first meeting when Jesus saw Nathanael approaching and declared, "Here is a true Israelite in whom there is no deceit." Nathanael, surprised that Jesus knew him, asked how. Jesus replied that he had seen Nathanael under a fig tree before Philip called him. This seemingly simple observation convinced Nathanael that Jesus was the Son of God and the King of Israel. This incident reveals something about Nathanael's character. He was apparently engaged in prayer or meditation under the fig tree when Jesus supernaturally perceived him. His immediate recognition of Jesus' divine insight and his quick confession of faith suggest a spiritually sensitive person who had been genuinely seeking truth. Jesus responded to Nathanael's confession with a promise, "You will see greater things than these. You will see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." This promise connected Jesus to Jacob's dream of the heavenly ladder, positioning Jesus as the meeting point between heaven and earth. After these initial gospel appearances, Bartholomew essentially disappears from biblical accounts. Like most of the 12, he is listed among the apostles, but receives no further individual attention in the Book of Acts or the epistles. However, early church traditions track his missionary journeys to several regions, including Mesopotamia, Persia, Egypt, Armenia, India, and even Lycaonia in Asia Minor. The diversity of these traditions suggests either that Bartholomew traveled extensively or that different regions claimed connection to him, possibly confusing him with other missionaries. The strongest traditions connect Bartholomew to Armenia, a kingdom located in the mountainous region between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. Ancient sources describe how Bartholomew traveled to Armenia and performed miracles that led to numerous conversions, including members of the royal family. Armenia would later become the first nation to officially adopt Christianity as its state religion in 31 AD, and Armenians trace this decision partly to Bartholomew's foundational work centuries earlier. The circumstances surrounding Bartholomew's martyrdom vary across different ancient sources, but several common elements emerge. According to tradition, Bartholomew's successful ministry in Armenia provoked opposition from pagan priests and the king's brother Astyages, who viewed Christianity as a threat to traditional Armenian religion and culture. When Bartholomew refused to sacrifice to Armenian gods and continued preaching Christ, Astyages ordered his arrest and execution. The method of execution described in multiple ancient sources is one of the most brutal in the history of martyrdom: flaying. This process involved removing the skin from a living victim, causing excruciating pain and eventual death from trauma and infection. Some accounts specify that Bartholomew was flayed alive and then beheaded or crucified to complete the execution. Art throughout Christian history has depicted Bartholomew holding his own skin or with a flaying knife, making him one of the most visually recognizable apostles despite his limited biblical appearances. Modern historians debate whether the flaying tradition is historical or legendary. Such extreme execution methods certainly occurred in the ancient world, particularly for individuals considered serious threats to religious or political authority. Roman sources document various creative torture and execution methods designed to terrorize populations into compliance. However, some scholars suggest the flaying tradition may have developed symbolically to represent Bartholomew's complete stripping of his earthly life in devotion to Christ, or it may confuse him with another martyr. What remains historically plausible is that Bartholomew engaged in missionary work in regions beyond the Roman Empire's core territories, and that he died as a martyr for his faith. The unanimous tradition of early church sources that Bartholomew was martyred, combined with the absence of any tradition suggesting he died naturally, provides reasonable confidence that he indeed faced execution for his testimony about Jesus. The psychological dimension of Bartholomew's martyrdom, particularly if the flaying tradition contains historical truth, raises profound questions. Flaying would be among the most agonizing deaths imaginable. Even the threat of such execution would typically break a person's will to maintain a false story. The fact that Bartholomew apparently went through this extreme suffering without recanting suggests either severe delusion or absolute certainty based on undeniable personal experience. The latter seems more psychologically plausible. Armenian Christian tradition has preserved Bartholomew's memory with special reverence. The Armenian Apostolic Church considers him and Thaddeus as the primary apostles who brought Christianity to Armenia. Several churches claim to possess Bartholomew's relics, including his skull, kept at the Basilica of Saint Bartholomew on Tiber Island in Rome. As with many apostolic relics, authenticating these remains is impossible, but their existence demonstrates how important physical connections to the apostles were for early Christian communities. Bartholomew's relics supposedly traveled extensively after his death. Tradition claims his body was initially buried in Armenia, then moved to Mesopotamia, then to an island in the Mediterranean, and eventually to Rome. These translations of relics were common practices in early Christianity, often motivated by invasions, church politics, or desires to bring apostolic presence to new locations. Each movement generated new stories and devotional practices around Bartholomew's memory. The artistic tradition of depicting Bartholomew with his skin became particularly prominent during the Renaissance. Michelangelo's Last Judgment fresco in the Sistine Chapel includes a famous image of Bartholomew holding his flayed skin, with the face on the skin believed to be Michelangelo's self-portrait. This artistic choice reflects both the martyrdom tradition and deeper theological themes about shedding earthly identity to embrace spiritual transformation. Bartholomew's missionary work in regions beyond the Roman Empire highlights the geographical scope of the apostolic mission. While some apostles focused on Jewish communities within the empire, others ventured into Parthian territories, Indian kingdoms, and independent regions like Armenia. This expansive reach suggests coordinated strategy, or at least shared commitment to taking the gospel to the ends of the earth, as Jesus had commanded before his ascension. The challenges facing missionaries in these distant regions were considerable. Language barriers, cultural differences, dangerous travel, and hostile religious authorities all threatened the success and survival of apostolic messengers. Yet the consistent testimony of early church sources indicates that Christianity reached remarkably distant locations within the 1st century after Jesus' death. Whether Bartholomew personally reached all the locations tradition credits him with visiting is uncertain, but the traditions reflect genuine early Christian expansion into these regions. Bartholomew's limited presence in biblical texts, yet prominent place in martyrdom traditions, illustrates an important aspect of apostolic history. Not all the 12 apostles received equal attention in the canonical scriptures. Some, like Peter and John, feature prominently. Others, like Bartholomew, appear briefly then disappear from the biblical narrative. This uneven coverage does not mean the lesser-known apostles were less important or less faithful. It simply reflects the particular interests and knowledge of the biblical authors. The traditions about the lesser-known apostles depend more heavily on later church writings, oral traditions, and regional claims. These sources are less historically reliable than the biblical texts written closer to the events they describe. However, completely dismissing these traditions would be unwarranted. They often preserve genuine historical memories, even if details have been embellished or confused over time. The challenge for historians is separating probable historical cause from later legendary developments. Like this video if the story of apostolic martyrdom challenges your assumptions about early Christianity. Bartholomew's reported willingness to endure even flaying rather than deny his testimony about Jesus raises the stakes for evaluating the resurrection claims. People can be mistaken in their beliefs and die for those mistakes. But people rarely endure torture. They could escape simply by admitting error, especially when they have nothing to gain and everything to lose. Bartholomew's martyrdom, like those of his fellow apostles, suggests these men possessed certainty that transcended normal human fear and self-preservation. Chapter 9. Thomas, from doubt to India's spear. Thomas Didymus, often called Doubting Thomas, overcame his initial skepticism to become one of the most traveled and courageous apostles. His journey from doubt to absolute certainty, culminating in martyrdom thousands of miles from Jerusalem, provides compelling testimony about the transformative power of personal encounter with the risen Christ. Thomas first appears prominently in the Gospel of John, when Jesus announced plans to return to Judea, despite recent threats on his life. While other disciples worried about danger, Thomas declared, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." This statement reveals Thomas's complex character, loyal enough to face death alongside Jesus, yet fatalistic about the probable outcome. He was no coward, but neither was he blindly optimistic. Later, at the Last Supper, when Jesus spoke about going to prepare a place for his followers, Thomas interrupted, "Lord, we do not know where you are going. So how can we know the way?" This question prompted one of Jesus' most famous declarations, "I am the way, and the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." Thomas's willingness to voice confusion rather than pretending to understand demonstrates intellectual honesty that would characterize his approach to faith. The incident that earned Thomas his doubting nickname occurred after Jesus' resurrection. When the other disciples told Thomas they had seen the risen Lord, he responded with a demand for empirical evidence. "Unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, and place my finger into the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side, I will never believe." Thomas insisted on sensory verification before accepting extraordinary claims. His skepticism seems reasonable given the circumstances. A week later, Jesus appeared to the disciples again, this time with Thomas present. Jesus specifically addressed Thomas's demands. "Put your finger here and see my hands, and put out your hand and place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe." The text does not explicitly state whether Thomas actually touched Jesus' wounds, but his immediate response was unambiguous, "My Lord and my God." This confession represented the most explicit declaration of Jesus' divinity in the Gospels, coming from the disciple who had demanded the strongest proof. Jesus' response to Thomas has resonated through centuries. "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." This statement acknowledged Thomas's genuine faith while pointing toward future generations who would believe based on apostolic testimony rather than personal resurrection appearances. Thomas's transformation from skeptic to absolute believer provided a model for others who would struggle with doubt, yet ultimately come to faith. After this convincing encounter, Thomas disappears from biblical narratives. However, strong early church traditions track his missionary journey eastward to Parthia and eventually to India. These traditions appear in the Acts of Thomas, a 3rd century apocryphal text that blends history with legendary elements. and in the testimony of early church writers who reference Thomas's Indian mission. The Indian traditions are particularly intriguing because they are supported by ancient Christian communities in India that have continuously claimed Thomas as their founder. The St. Thomas Christians of Kerala in southern India maintain traditions about Thomas's arrival along the Malabar coast, his establishment of 7 churches, his performance of miracles, and his eventual martyrdom. These communities existed long before European missionaries arrived in India, suggesting apostolic age origins. According to tradition, Thomas arrived in India around 52 AD, landing near present-day Kodungalur. He preached to both Jewish communities that had settled in India and to native Indian populations. His message of a God who became human, died, and rose again would have sounded strange in a culture familiar with Hindu concepts of divine incarnations, but unfamiliar with Jewish messianic expectations. Despite cultural barriers, Thomas apparently established Christian communities that survived and grew over subsequent centuries. The Acts of Thomas, while containing clearly legendary material, may preserve some historical memories of Thomas's ministry. It describes his travels through various Indian regions, his confrontations with local religious authorities, and his miracles that led to conversions. While the slavery story seems legendary, it may reflect the genuine difficulties of reaching India from the Mediterranean world. Thomas's missionary success eventually provoked opposition. Tradition holds that he particularly angered Brahmin priests in Mylapore, near modern Chennai, by converting members of prominent families to Christianity. Converting high-caste Indians undermined the religious and social hierarchy that privileged Brahmin authority. When Thomas refused to stop preaching despite warnings, local authorities decided he must be silenced permanently. The traditional account of Thomas's martyrdom states that he was praying in a cave on a hill when soldiers came to arrest him. Rather than fleeing or fighting, Thomas calmly continued praying. One of the soldiers thrust a spear into Thomas's side, echoing the wound Jesus received on the cross. Thomas died from this injury, his blood staining the cave floor. The location, now called St. Thomas Mount in Chennai, has been a pilgrimage site for centuries. The method of execution by spear is medically plausible and historically appropriate. Spears were common weapons throughout the ancient world, and execution by stabbing would be quick and effective. Some traditions add that Thomas was also lanced multiple times, turning his death into a more prolonged torture. Whether death came quickly or slowly, the consistent tradition is that Thomas died from spear wounds inflicted because he would not stop proclaiming Christ. Archaeological and historical evidence provides intriguing support for Thomas's Indian mission. Ancient trade routes connected the Roman Empire to India through both maritime routes across the Arabian Sea and overland routes through Parthia and Central Asia. Roman coins and artifacts have been discovered in southern India, confirming active trade during the 1st century. Christian travelers and missionaries could have used these same routes to reach India. The St. Thomas Christians developed distinctive liturgies, traditions, and organizational structures that differ from later European Christian influences. Their ancient liturgy used Syriac, the language of early Christianity in the Parthian Empire and Mesopotamia, rather than Latin or Greek. This linguistic connection suggests their Christianity came from the Syriac-speaking regions through which Thomas would have traveled to reach India, supporting claims of apostolic age origins rather than later missionary activity. Additionally, ancient sources outside Christian texts reference Christian communities in India at remarkably early dates. The Christian writer Pantaenus reportedly traveled to India around 190 AD and found Christians there who possessed a Hebrew copy of Matthew's Gospel, which they claimed Bartholomew had brought them. While Pantaenus may have confused Bartholomew with Thomas, his report confirms established Christian communities in India by the late 2nd century, well before any organized missionary efforts from Europe. The tomb of Thomas in Chennai has been venerated since ancient times. The current San Tomi Basilica is built over the traditional burial site. Archaeological excavations at the site have found evidence of ancient Christian presence, though definitively identifying 1st century remains is impossible. Nevertheless, the continuous tradition associating this location with Thomas's burial, combined with the ancient St. Thomas Christian communities, provides reasonable historical support for Thomas's Indian mission and martyrdom. Thomas's journey from doubt to martyrdom in India raises profound questions about conversion and certainty. He began as a skeptic who demanded empirical evidence before believing extraordinary claims. After receiving that evidence in his encounter with the risen Jesus, he became so certain that he traveled thousands of dangerous miles to proclaim this message in a completely foreign culture. Finally, he accepted death rather than recant this testimony. This progression from doubt to absolute certainty to willing martyrdom challenges skeptical dismissals of the resurrection. Thomas was not a gullible believer who accepted claims without evidence. He was a doubter who demanded proof. Yet, after receiving that proof, his transformation was total and permanent. He could have remained safely in Jerusalem or returned to Galilee. Instead, he embarked on one of history's most ambitious missionary journeys, ultimately dying for the message he once questioned. Comment your thoughts on how someone could transform so completely from doubt to willingness to die for a belief. Thomas's story suggests that genuine encounter with evidence can produce certainty strong enough to overcome both cultural barriers and fear of death. His martyrdom in India, far from the peer pressure of other believers or the excitement of Jerusalem's early church, indicates personal conviction rather than social conformity, drove his mission. Chapter 10. Matthew, from tax collector to martyr. Matthew, also called Levi, held perhaps the most despised occupation in Jewish Palestine when Jesus called him to discipleship. Tax collectors were viewed as traitors who collaborated with Roman oppression and extorted their own people. They were excluded from polite society, banned from synagogues, and classified alongside prostitutes and sinners in public opinion. Yet Jesus not only spoke to Matthew but invited him into the inner circle of disciples, scandalizing religious observers. The Gospel accounts describe Matthew's call with remarkable brevity. Jesus saw him sitting at the tax booth and simply said, "Follow me." Matthew immediately left everything and followed. This quick response suggests either that Matthew had heard Jesus' teaching before this moment, or that Jesus' reputation was so compelling that a simple invitation was sufficient. Whatever the reason, Matthew abandoned a lucrative career to join an itinerant teacher with no apparent means of financial support. Matthew's first recorded action as a disciple was hosting a large dinner for Jesus at his house, inviting many tax collectors and sinners to meet his new master. This party outraged Pharisees, who questioned why Jesus would eat with such unsavory company. Jesus' response became a defining statement of his mission. "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Matthew's dinner party became an object lesson in Jesus' radical inclusion of social outcasts. Matthew's background as a tax collector provided unique skills that would serve the early church. He was literate, educated, and trained in record keeping. While fishermen like Peter struggled with formal education, Matthew could write fluently in multiple languages. Many scholars believe these skills positioned Matthew to write the Gospel bearing his name, which shows particular interest in how Jesus fulfilled Jewish prophecies and demonstrates sophisticated organizational structure. The Gospel of Matthew became especially important for Jewish Christians trying to understand how Jesus related to their traditional scriptures and expectations. This Gospel begins with a genealogy tracing Jesus' lineage through David to Abraham, establishing his Jewish credentials. It organizes Jesus' teachings into 5 major discourses, perhaps mirroring the 5 books of Moses. It includes more Old Testament quotations than the other Gospels, repeatedly showing how Jesus fulfilled prophetic promises. Whether Matthew actually wrote this Gospel remains debated among scholars. Ancient church tradition unanimously attributes it to him, but modern scholars note the Gospel was written in sophisticated Greek while Matthew lightly spoke Aramaic. Some scholars suggest Matthew wrote an earlier Aramaic version that was later translated and expanded by another author, while others maintain Matthew wrote the Greek version himself using earlier sources. The authorship question does not affect the Gospel's historical value, but does impact how directly we can connect it to apostolic eyewitness testimony. After Jesus' ascension, Matthew likely remained in Jerusalem with the other apostles initially, helping to establish the growing church. However, traditions about his later missionary work vary significantly. Some sources place him in Ethiopia, others in Parthia, Persia, or Syria. The ancient historian Rufinus wrote that Matthew preached in Ethiopia and was martyred there. Other traditions connect him to Hierapolis in Asia Minor or various locations in Persia. The most detailed traditions place Matthew's final ministry in Ethiopia, though Ethiopia in ancient sources sometimes refer to various regions of Africa beyond Egypt, rather than the modern nation of Ethiopia. According to these accounts, Matthew traveled to Ethiopia and performed miracles that led to numerous conversions, including members of the royal family and local nobility. As with other apostles, Matthew's success provoked opposition from established religious authorities and those whose power depended on traditional religious structures. When Matthew converted the king's son or brother, accounts vary, pagan priests convinced the king that Christianity threatened Ethiopian culture and royal authority. The king ordered Matthew to sacrifice to Ethiopian gods or face execution. Matthew refused, maintaining that Christ alone deserved worship. The method of Matthew's execution varies across different traditions. Some sources claim he was stabbed or speared to death. Others say he was burned alive, and still others suggest he was beheaded or killed with a halberd while praying. The diversity of these accounts suggests that reliable historical details about Matthew's death did not survive as clearly as details about Peter or James. However, the consistent tradition across all sources is that Matthew was indeed martyred for his faith rather than dying naturally. One particularly vivid tradition describes Matthew being killed while he was celebrating the Eucharist or leading worship. This detail, even if legendary, reflects how early Christians understood martyrdom as the ultimate act of worship, the final offering of one's life to God. Dying while leading others in worship portrayed Matthew's death not as tragedy, but as his final service to the community he had shepherded. The location and fate of Matthew's remains became the subject of various claims. Some traditions say he was buried in Ethiopia where he died. Others claim his body was later moved to Parthia, then to various cities in Italy. The cathedral in Salerno, Italy, claims to possess Matthew's relics brought there in the 10th century. As with most apostolic relics, definitive authentication is impossible, but the claims reflect ongoing devotion to Matthew's memory. Matthew's transformation from tax collector to martyr demonstrates the radical nature of conversion in early Christianity. He abandoned a career that provided wealth and security to follow a teacher who promised suffering and sacrifice. He left behind a despised but profitable profession to join a movement that offered only rejection and persecution. His willingness to make this exchange and to eventually die for his decision suggests he found something more valuable than financial security or social standing. The inclusion of a tax collector among the 12 apostles also carried theological significance. It demonstrated that Jesus came to save sinners, not reward the righteous. Matthew's presence among the disciples proclaimed that no one was beyond redemption, no occupation so compromised that it permanently disqualified someone from serving God. This message of radical inclusion became central to Christianity's appeal across social classes and occupations. Matthew's potential authorship of the gospel meant his contribution to Christianity extended far beyond his personal missionary work. The Gospel of Matthew has shaped Christian understanding of Jesus for 2 millennia. It has been the most frequently quoted gospel in early Christian writings, suggesting it was particularly valued by the ancient church. Its emphasis on Jesus fulfilling prophecy helped Jewish converts understand their Messiah within their own scriptural tradition. The specific details of Matthew's missionary travels and martyrdom remain uncertain compared to apostles like Peter or James, whose deaths are better documented. However, the unanimous early church tradition that he died as a martyr, combined with the absence of any contradictory tradition suggesting natural death, provides reasonable confidence that Matthew joined his fellow apostles in sealing his testimony with his blood. Share this video with others interested in the historical foundations of Christianity. Matthew's story illustrates how Jesus transformed unlikely candidates into powerful witnesses, a despised tax collector, became an honored martyr and possibly the author of Christianity's most influential gospel. His journey from social outcast to faithful apostle encourages anyone who feels their past disqualifies them from significant service. Chapter 11. The lesser-known warriors. The remaining apostles, James son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus also called Judas son of James, and Simon the Zealot, receive limited attention in biblical texts and less detailed treatment in historical traditions, yet their obscurity should not diminish their importance. These men equally participated in Jesus' ministry, witnessed his resurrection, and carried the gospel message into diverse regions. Their relative anonymity in historical records reflects the incomplete nature of our sources rather than any lack of faithfulness or impact. James son of Alphaeus is often called James the Less to distinguish him from James son of Zebedee. The nickname might indicate younger age, shorter stature, or less prominence rather than any negative judgment. Some traditions identify him as a cousin of Jesus, though this connection is disputed. He appears in the lists of the 12 apostles, but receives no individual attention in gospel narratives or the book of Acts. Traditions about James the Less's missionary work vary widely. Some sources place him in Egypt, others in Syria or Persia. One prominent tradition claims he preached in Jerusalem and became a leader of the church there, where he was eventually thrown from the temple pinnacle by scribes and Pharisees who opposed his message. When the fall did not kill him, the tradition states he was beaten to death with clubs, praying for his executioners as he died. However, many scholars believe this tradition confuses James son of Alphaeus with James the brother of Jesus, who is explicitly identified as a Jerusalem church leader in the book of Acts and Paul's epistles. The James who was thrown from the temple and beaten to death was likely Jesus' brother rather than James son of Alphaeus. This confusion in later traditions demonstrates the challenges of tracking the lesser-known apostles whose names and identities sometimes blurred in historical memory. Despite this confusion, the consistent tradition is that James son of Alphaeus engaged in missionary work and died as a martyr. Even if we cannot pinpoint the exact location or circumstances of his death, the pattern holds. He testified about Jesus' resurrection and refused to recant when facing persecution. His willingness to maintain his testimony even unto death suggests the same certainty that motivated his better documented companions. Thaddeus, also called Judas son of James and sometimes identified with Lebbaeus, presents similar challenges. He appears in apostolic lists but receives only one brief mention in the Gospel of John. At the Last Supper, Thaddeus asked Jesus, "Lord, why do you intend to show yourself to us and not to the world?" Jesus responded by explaining that loving obedience to his commands would result in intimate fellowship with God. This brief exchange reveals Thaddeus' curiosity about Jesus' mission strategy, but provides little biographical information. Ancient traditions associate Thaddeus with missionary work in Mesopotamia, Persia, Armenia, and the region of Edessa in modern-day Turkey. One particularly intriguing tradition involves a correspondence between Jesus and King Abgar of Edessa. According to this legend, King Abgar sent a letter inviting Jesus to come heal him. Jesus allegedly wrote back declining to visit but promising to send a disciple after his ascension. After Pentecost, Thaddeus supposedly traveled to Edessa, healed King Abgar, and established Christianity in the region. Modern scholars generally regard the Abgar correspondence as legend rather than history. No contemporary sources mention these letters, and they first appear in the 4th century writings of church historian Eusebius, who claimed to have found them in the Edessa archives. However, even if the letter exchange is legendary, it may preserve genuine historical memory of Thaddeus' mission to Edessa and surrounding regions. The legend's existence suggests Edessa's Christian community traced its origins to apostolic times and connected itself to one of the 12. The circumstances of Thaddeus' death remain obscure. Most traditions place his martyrdom in Persia, often in connection with Simon the Zealot. According to these accounts, Thaddeus and Simon worked together preaching in Persia when pagan priests convinced local authorities that their message threatened Persian religion and culture. Both were arrested and refused to sacrifice to Persian gods. They were then executed, with various traditions specifying death by being clubbed, stoned, or hacked to pieces. Simon the Zealot's nickname indicates his connection to the Zealot movement, a Jewish political faction advocating violent resistance against Roman occupation. The Zealots believed God would support military rebellion against Rome, and they carried out assassinations and attacks to advance their cause. Simon's Zealot background made his inclusion among the 12 particularly surprising. Jesus' movement was explicitly non-violent, and including a known zealot risked attracting unwanted Roman attention. Simon's presence among the 12 alongside Matthew, the tax collector, created fascinating tension. Matthew had collaborated with Rome for profit. Simon had resisted Rome through violence. These men represented opposite responses to Roman occupation, yet Jesus called them both and required them to cooperate. Their ability to work together, despite their radically different backgrounds, demonstrated that Christ's kingdom transcended political divisions. After Jesus' ascension, traditions track Simon's missionary travels to Egypt, North Africa, Mauritania, and eventually Persia. The pairing of Simon with Thaddeus for their Persian mission appears in multiple independent traditions, suggesting it preserves historical memory despite limited details. Their combined efforts apparently established Christian communities across the Persian Empire, beyond the reach of Roman authority or persecution. The martyrdom of Simon and Thaddeus in Persia likely occurred during the 60s AD, though precise dating is impossible. Persia had its own complex religious environment dominated by Zoroastrianism, with various mystery religions and local cults also commanding devotion. Christianity's exclusive claims would have provoked opposition from multiple quarters. When Simon and Thaddeus refused to compromise their message despite threats, authorities resorted to execution to silence them. The specific method of their execution varies across traditions. Some sources describe Simon being sawed in half, others mention crucifixion or spearing. Thaddeus is variously described as being clubbed to death, beheaded, or shot with arrows. The diversity of these accounts suggests the precise details did not survive, but the core tradition of their martyrdom in Persia remains consistent across sources. The partnership of Simon and Thaddeus for their Persian mission illustrates how apostles often worked in pairs or teams. Jesus had originally sent them out 2 by 2 during his ministry, and this pattern continued afterward. Working together provided mutual encouragement, allowed for more effective teaching and testimony, and meant that witnesses could confirm each other's accounts. When both members of a team went to their deaths maintaining the same testimony, it strengthened the credibility of their message. The relative obscurity of James, Thaddeus, and Simon should not obscure their significance. They equally witnessed Jesus' ministry, resurrection, and ascension. They received the same commission to spread the gospel to all nations. They faced the same dangers and accepted the same risks as their better-known companions. Their willingness to die rather than recant their testimony about the resurrection carries the same evidential weight as Peter's or John's martyrdom. The fact that even the lesser-known apostles went to their deaths maintaining their testimony about Jesus strengthens the case for the resurrection's historicity. If the resurrection was a fabrication, one would expect at least some apostles, particularly the less prominent ones with less to lose from recanting, to break under pressure and reveal the fraud. That even the obscure apostles whose names barely appear in the biblical record chose death over denial suggests they all possessed certainty based on genuine experience. Like this video if you appreciate learning about the lesser-known apostles who deserve recognition for their faithfulness. Their stories remind us that fame and historical prominence do not measure true significance. Many faithful servants of God labor in obscurity, their contributions known fully only to God. Yet their faithfulness matters as much as the faithfulness of those whose names everyone recognizes. James, Thaddeus, and Simon represent countless believers throughout history whose names are forgotten but whose faith and sacrifice built the church. Chapter 12, the betrayer's tragic end, Judas Iscariot, stands apart from the other 11 apostles. While they went to martyrdom refusing to deny Jesus, Judas betrayed Jesus and then took his own life in apparent despair. His story raises troubling questions about predestination, free will, and the possibility of unforgivable sin. Yet his tragic end also illustrates the devastating consequences of betraying conscience and the difference between true conversion and superficial association. Judas came from Kerioth in Judea, making him likely the only apostle not from Galilee.